First order of business is request for bill introductions. And if nobody else has one, I have one. It is 25 RS 0630, and it is a Kansas Data Commission Act linking longitudinal data, education, workforce, and commerce, and there'll be a public search registry that won't be named to the student or the certificate holder, but it will let people know how many certificates we have in our state. So that is 25 RS 0630, unless anyone has an issue with that. All right, thank you. Anybody else? And with that, we are going to dive in. My only coaching for the committee this week is, and I've asked Jennifer Light and Dr. Harwood to help me with this, is I think we really need to think in a focused way this week about the budget of the different requests, you know, the governor's request, the legislative budget committee, and the department, and look at the differences and ask pointed questions around those things. The K through 12 is so big and so important that there's a lot of different issues. You could almost talk about anything by talking about this budget. So I really wanted to guide us this week in these 3 days of deliberation and looking over it and gathering understanding, that we really focus on the things that we need to make a decision on Thursday and Friday. If we get to Friday, hopefully just Thursday. So that's my guidance. KLRD, Jennifer Light, thank you for being here. Thank you for all your help.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jennifer Light, and I'm the fiscal analyst for the KSDE budget. Behind me in the audience is Dr. Frank Harwood, Deputy Commissioner of the Fiscal and Administrative Services, along with several staff. You will be hearing from him after me. The way this is going to work this week is I'm going to do a high-level overview of the entire budget, and then Dr. Harwood is going to talk about the budget broken up in different pieces over the different days. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but the chair wanted to make sure that there was enough time for KSDE to answer the questions as well. And so, again, I'll be here all week, able to answer questions, but the majority of the time you will see somebody from KSDE up here. So I'm going to start with the document I handed out on Friday that is the budget summary overview. So this is the front page of that document. The front page of that document has the budget summary, the actuals for fiscal year 2024, the agency's request for fiscal year 25, then what the LBC recommended for fiscal year 25, agency 26, and the legislative budget committee for fiscal year 2026. Starting at the top of page 2, you can see that the revised fiscal year 2025 agency request is $6.6 billion, including $4.8 billion SGF. The special committee on legislative budget had a final number of $6.6 billion with $4.8 billion SGF. So at the bottom of page 2, you can see that there is an SGF reappropriation line. The agency carried over $21.6 million unspent SGF monies from fiscal year 24 into fiscal year 25. This includes money for state foundation aid, supplemental state aid, the school district juvenile detention facilities and Flint Hill Job Corps Center grants, and then special education state aid. The agency indicated that they plan to use the reappropriated funds for the same purposes as they were originally designated for in fiscal year 2024. And then the special committee on legislative budget did remove $2.1 million of the reappropriations. This is for the state aid to the juvenile detention facilities and the special education state aid. The money that was reappropriated for state foundation aid and supplemental state aid was rolled into part of the consensus numbers, so it has been addressed with the fall consensus. Other reappropriations include $2.5 million in the Children's Initiative Fund and the Kansas Endowment for Youth monies, and this includes money for the Early Childhood Block Grant, the Early Childhood Infrastructure, Imagination Library, Parents as Teachers, the Pre-K Pilot, and the Children's Cabinet Administration. The agency does not have any supplemental requests for fiscal year 2025. Item number 4 talks about the state aid return to spring 2024 consensus estimate. I do want to mention that items 4 and 7 combined end up with the final numbers for the fall 2025 consensus, which I'll be talking about at the end of the budget summary. So the LBC, the special committee made no change to that. For salaries and wages, the agency's revised request included an increase of just over $692,000 for salaries and wages and a net increase of 3 FTE positions. This is primarily due to the agency adding 8 positions and eliminating 5 FTE positions. You can see the new positions on the bottom of page 3, and the top of page 4 includes the eliminated positions. The LBC did delete $400,141, all from federal funds for the salaries and wages, and deleted the 8 FTE positions in fiscal year 2025. This is within this salaries and wages section, there is a discussion point for the cost indices, and then there was the new FTE positions. And so the increase of $291,000 that's in there still would be for the cost indice changes to make sure that that stayed stable. But when the LBC made the recommendation to pull new FTEs, the 8 FTEs were pulled at that point. So that is what that is about. The 5 positions the agency decided to remove. The special committee gave the direction about new FTE positions, and then the 8 positions were removed after that. The agency also requested the inclusion of language for the transfer of a cash balance in the school district capital improvements fund for the SGF in fiscal year 2025. There's a current balance of $328 in there that happened after the final 2023 payment was made. This fund is no longer being used for school district capital improvements. We now have an SGF fund, and so they're just wanting to move the money back into the fund that would be used for capital improvements. Item number 7 is the fall education consensus. And then item number 8 is all other adjustments, which includes an additional $1.7 million, including a decrease of $29 SGF as the sum of all other adjustments in fiscal year 2025. Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions on 25 or move to 26.
Committee questions on 2025? If not, I have just one, and that transfer cash balance to SGF, that LBC said to delete the language for the authority to transfer. So if it remains concur with LBC, what happens to that $328?
It remains in that, in the 2000 level fund for the school district finance fund.
Just for clarity, that fund is not going to be used for anything, so it would just sit there and be wasted.
That's correct.
Okay, we're going to do something with that. Not sure what yet, so. Any other questions on 2025? Oh, sorry, Representative Estes.
Thank you. Could you guys explain why we have so much to reappropriate from state foundation aid and supplemental state aid?
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, state foundation aid and supplemental state aid is done as part of the formula. And so we do reevaluate that with the consensus estimates, and we will be discussing that further down the road at the end of this. But $9.8 million, the appropriation for fiscal year 2025 is $2.7 billion. And so this $9.8 million, by the time we got the final numbers in for the school districts, the money was just not needed for the fiscal year 2024. So it moved into the numbers for fiscal year 2025 to be used there.
I like having those big numbers right beside these smaller ones. So what would the supplemental state aid, do you know how much? Because it's 9.7 and it was part of the consensus. What would that be up against? Do you know?
Sure. So on the lovely goldenrod sheet of paper, and if you don't have one, we do have some extras that we have brought to committee and we can hand out. But if you look on that, the bold area that says supplemental state aid, for fiscal year 2025, we're talking about $595 million. So the reappropriation of $9.7 million came from the final number for fiscal year 2024.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. Any other questions on 2025 before we move on to 2026? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Jennifer.
Top of page 5 is agency request for 26. The agency requested $6.8 billion, including $5.1 billion SGF. The budget analysis summary and budget request goes all the way down page 5 to the top of page 6. There are 9 enhancement requests that you can see listed there. None of the 9 was recommended by the Special Committee on the Legislative Budget. On top of page 6, I'm going to run through the enhancements really quick. We are going to go more in depth on these as we go through the week, but just to give you an overview of what all the enhancement requests were. Their agency's request includes an enhancement of $87.6 million SGF for special education state aid for fiscal year 26 for the first year of a 3-year plan to get to the 92% in excess costs. You can see in the table in the middle of the page, that is the estimated excess costs, the estimated state aid, the percentage of excess costs, and then at the very far right, you can see that that's the additional cost of $87.6 million every year. The governor's recommendation does include a 4-year plan for this of $72.6 million per year, and it would be to 92% in fiscal year 2029. Item number 2 is Safe and Secure Schools Grant. The agency requested an enhancement of $10 million SGF to the Safe and Secure Schools grants for fiscal years 2026. This would give the program a total of $15 million SGF. The legislature appropriated $5 million per year in fiscal years 24 and 25. This $15 million would not include any additional school districts. It just would ensure that the entirety of the amounts requested by the school districts were paid out if the fiscal year 2024 numbers held the same in 25 and 26. Item number 3 is professional development. The agency includes an enhancement request for an additional $4.5 million SGF for the professional development program for fiscal year 26, which would bring the total appropriation to $6.25 million for fiscal year 26 and would fully fund the program. The program has received appropriations of $1.8 million SGF each year in fiscal years 23, 24, and 25. Middle of page 7 is the mentor teacher program. The agency requests an additional $1 million SGF in funding for the mentor teacher program, which would bring the total appropriation to $2.3 million SGF for fiscal year 2026. Bottom of page 7 is item number 5 to replace the SFRF E-rate funding. So the agency requests $1 million SGF to replace the State Fiscal Recovery Fund money for fiscal year 26. This funding currently provides the 10% state match for the E-rate program, which provides discounts on high-speed internet access and telecommunications in eligible schools and libraries nationwide, and priority is given to schools and libraries in low-income and rural areas. Middle of page 8 is item 6, implementing 2024 House Sub for Senate Bill 387. So the agency's request includes $626,500 SGF and 6 FTE positions to implement the provisions of 2024 House Sub for Senate Bill 387. The agency also indicates that without these positions, KSD will not be able to effectively implement the legislation both from House Sub for Senate Bill 387, along with the other reporting requirements and administrative responsibilities that have increased over the last several years. This enhancement request includes $531,000 SGF for salaries and wages, $65,000 SGF for furniture and equipment, and $25,000 SGF for contractual services. Item 7 is for CTE transportation, and it includes $517,000 to fully fund the Career and Technical Education Transportation Program. This would increase the total funding to $2 million SGF for fiscal year 2026 and would fully fund the program. Top of page 9 discusses State Board of Education compensation. The agency's request includes $170,000 SGF to increase the compensation of the members of the Kansas State Board of Education for fiscal year 26. Since the 1970s, the state board members' salaries have been tied to the state legislative salaries. And then with the passage of 23 Senate Bill 229, salaries were increased for all statewide elected officials except for state board members and legislators. And then the legislature also has received a salary increase starting at the beginning of this legislative session due to the recommendations of the Legislative Compensation Committee. Item number 9, and the last one of the enhancement requests, is to replace the E-rate transfer from the Kansas Board of Regents. This is different than the one that we had in item number 5, and this is an enhancement request for $95,920 to replace a transfer from KBOR to the E-rate system. The governor's recommendation does have a difference here. The governor does only delete the transfer. She does not indicate she wants to include an SGF replacement. And the Special Committee on Legislative Budget decided to not do the SGF and include the transfer from KBOR. Item number 10 is, again, the state aid return to the spring 2024 consensus. That goes along with item number 16 on page 11 to finalize the fall 2024 education consensus. Top of page 10 is the state aid and other assistance changes. There's a decrease of $107.7 million in state aid and other assistance. This is due to an anticipated decrease within federal funds, including ARPA money and elementary and secondary school aid, offset slightly by an anticipated increase in special education state grant aids. There's also a decrease in CIF funds due to the one-time funding of the $5 million for the public-private partnership with the Children's Cabinet. The agency's request also includes an increase of $6.4 million, including just over $36,000 SGF in contractual services for fiscal year 2026, mainly due to an increase in other professional fees. Item number 13, middle of the page, the agency's request includes an increase of just over $939,000 for salaries and wages and additional 3.0 FTE positions. I do want to say that these FTE positions here in 13 are the same as they are in 2025. This is not an additional 3 on top of those 3, or when we discussed in 25 that there was the decrease in 5 and the addition of 8, this is the same thing. So it's broken out for you specifically in 25 and then again in 26, so you understand that it is happening in both places, but it is not an additional 3 on top of the ones that they were requesting in 25. It's the same ones that we had listed out in 25. Bottom of page 10, the agency also requests reauthorization of the 20 mil property tax levy for fiscal year 26 and 27. Top of page 11 is additional legislative requests. There are several things that have been in the budget bills for the last several years that they just would like to have additional language on. This includes the interfund transfers between the agency's SGF accounts, the ability to distribute state aid from the state safety fund whenever the funds are available rather than by November 1st. And then the ability to distribute donations of income tax refunds made by the Kansas taxpayer for all school districts, which would be used when a specific school district is not chosen when they do their taxpayer when they do their donations on their tax funds. Item number 16 finishes up the fall 2026 consensus estimates, and then all other adjustments includes $35,000 in all funding, including a decrease of just over $96,000 SGF. Pages 9 and 10 are reference tables for you for last 10 years. Pages 13 through 19 are special topics, which includes a breakout of the state operations by program, the state aid tables, and then the CRE estimates. I do want to just mention briefly that there are no supplemental or enhancement requests for the Children's Cabinet. With that, I'd be happy to stand for questions on the budget, or I'm happy to move to the consensus revenue estimates.
I think we're doing okay on time. If there's questions for 2026, Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Jennifer. Page 10, item 14, the 20 mil reauthorization. I don't recall this conversation in LBC. Did another recommendation come out of the LBC as to when to reauthorize the 20 mils?
Mr. Chair, it was included as part of the language only in the additional legislative requests for that special committee. I would have to defer to Nick on this, but I believe that after further discussion, it would not be part of the budget. It would likely violate the single subject requirements of the Constitution, and so therefore would have to be its own separate bill. But it is supposed to be renewed every 2 years, and so the agency did want to make sure that that was on everybody, that everybody was aware of that. So it was mentioned in the additional legislative requests at that time for the special committee on the legislative budget, in which all of those language-only requests were pulled out as part of the.
Nick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Jenny is correct. This 20 mil reauthorization provision, traditionally when we've had our education budget bills that have only dealt with education, oftentimes this has been included in those education bills. At other times it was included in tax bills, larger taxing bills. But since this education budget, we're going to be reporting back to have the appropriate, to be included in an appropriations bill, we've got concerns about revenue raising provisions in an appropriations bill. So this will need to be a separate, contained in some separate piece of legislation. So I don't know how the committee wants to act on it, but it will not be going into the appropriations bill.
Well, it sounds like we don't have the authority to act on it. It needs to be something that tax or a separate bill needs to take up, but yeah, good catch there. Representative Estes.
Do you have any further detail on page 7, number 3, more specific about what is the proposed professional development? And it's okay if you don't, I just thought I'd see if you knew.
Well, and I think we'll have Dr. Harwood up here in just a second. Maybe he can shed a little light on it too, unless there's anything you want to say, but you definitely don't have to.
I would defer to the agency to give a little bit more of a description of what they're planning to use that for.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? 2026 overview. Representative McNorton might be the last one, so we can get to consensus numbers. Go ahead. No, Representative
Thank you,
McNorton.
Mr. Chair. So real quick, Jenny, the number 1 bullet point, special education. I guess, explain to me, I thought last year, or maybe more, we were at the 92% and had an additional 75 million put in that pot. The way I read this, we need to put the 87.6 million in there to reach the 92%. Am I reading that wrong? On page 6.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, the special education state aid last year did have a request both from the agency and the governor to increase to get to the 92% within the next several years. We were not at 92% last year. I was just trying to see if I have that number.
Well, there's this chart right below it that.
Yes, so that would be where we're at. According to the consensus documents this year, we are at 75.7% of excess costs. And then it'd be 75.4% if we were not counting that 2.5 million ARPA dollars, which we're not counting as moving forward, so it's not counting as part of the maintenance of effort. So in the end, we are at 75.4% in fiscal year 2025, and then these would move us forward. The agency request, by adding the 87.6 million, would continue to move forward towards the 92% by 2028. The governor's recommendation is 72.6 million would get it there in the next 4 years. I can tell you that for special education last year, we were at 69.3% according to the fall education consensus. And I do not have the document up here that has the final numbers for where we were at the end of last year. But overall, the answer is we were at, currently in 25, we are at 75.4%.
Thank you for the question and thank you for the answer. I think we will move on to your all-important document if you are ready for it.
The goldenrod 11 by 14 has a lot of numbers on it. I'm just going to walk through it pretty simply here. I know that each of you received the copy of the Education Finance Formulas memo, which is a lengthy document in and of itself. Basically, to give you an overview, there are 7 sections that we consider part of the state finance formulas that we do with consensus revenue estimates. It's the state foundation aid, supplemental state aid, special education state aid, capital outlay state aid, capital improvement state aid, and then the CAPERS dollars for both USDs and non-USDs. All of these are in the school finance memo with the formulas for them. If you look on the piece of paper that's in front of you, you can see that for each section we have them broken down on the left-hand side, and then the fiscal years we have going through columns. So, with that all being said, the Education Consensus Group met on November 5th and did include in its estimates the impact on policy changes that occurred in legislation, both from last session and the special session. So it included changes for enrollment to current year prior year, with school year 24-25 having the option of the arithmetic mean of the prior year, second preceding year. It includes the adjustment for residential property tax exemptions to increasing to $75,000, and it included the changes in virtual state aid. So the document shows the estimates for fiscal year 25, 26, and 27, with the difference of fiscal year 25 and 27 on the very right side of the document. For base aid, which is the base for what it goes out for students, fiscal year 2025 remains at $5,738. For fiscal year 26, we moved it to $5,611, which is an increase of 4.3%. This is done based off of the CPIU. This is slightly less than the spring estimate, which had it at 4.5%. In fiscal year 27, we moved to $5,762 per student, which is an increase of 2.7%. Again, the CPIU takes the last 3 years and does the average of them, and that's how we get to the percentage that we're moving up in base. For state foundation aid for fiscal year 25, we're at $3.7 billion, which is a decrease of $180.3 million from the approved. Fiscal year 26, we are looking at $3.9 billion, which is a decrease of $192 million from the appropriation. This includes $2.8 billion SGF. In fiscal year 27, which is the first time you will be seeing these numbers because it's the first estimate that includes fiscal year 27, we're looking at $4 billion, including an increase of $104 million from the fiscal year 2026 numbers, and this includes $2.9 billion SGF. So the decreases in 25 and 26 are mainly due to the fact that the 2024 legislature included appropriations of higher SGF amounts in anticipation of that residential property tax changes. They didn't occur during the spring session. During the special session, they did. SB 1 also did move it. The spring, the discussion was at $100,000. What passed in the special session was $75,000 as the exemption. Senate Bill 1 from the special session also included a transfer from the SGF to the School District Finance Fund to cover the differences between the previous exemption and the $75,000. So if you see on here, there is a new line underneath state foundation aid, which says transfer from SGF to the SDFF. And that is the transfer that is going in thanks to Senate Bill 1 to cover the difference between the 42-ish thousand and the 75,000. Supplemental state aid is also based on property tax, and it can go up to 32.05% of total foundation aid. We are getting close to the statutory limit of the 33% max overall. In fiscal year 2025, we have that at $595 million, which is a decrease of $3 million from the previous appropriation. Fiscal year 26 is $621 million, which is a decrease of $4 million from what we had appropriated. And then fiscal year 2027 is $637 million, which is an increase of $16 million, but that is from fiscal year 26. Again, remember that all 27 numbers, this is the first time that the appropriation is happening. So it will always be an increase from what the fiscal year 26 numbers have. For special education, in fiscal year 2025, the consensus estimate has a slight increase due to the reappropriations of that $23,000. The Special Committee on Legislative Budget did pull that $23,000 out of the reappropriations and did not include it. Special education money, and I'm sure that Dr. Harwood is going to speak more to this as we go along here tonight, has to be handed out to all districts, and so therefore the $23,000 just wasn't going to be able to be handed out to all the districts, and so it was reappropriated. But I'm sure Dr. Harwood will.
It would have been about $81 each. So I did the math, and it wasn't going to do a whole lot. So they needed to do something different with it. All right, thank you.
In fiscal year 26 and 27, we appropriated $601.0 million. For the years 26 and 27, we leave flat when we're doing estimates unless there's a specific addition to the appropriation, either by the legislature or a stated legislative plan to increase it. So the governor's or the agency's plans are not included in the consensus numbers when we talk about the numbers going out for special education state aid. For capital outlay, fiscal year 2025 has $103 million, which is the same as the previous. 2026 is $107 million, which is an increase of $4 million or 3.9%. And fiscal year 2027 is $111 million, which is an increase of $4 million or 3.7%. So capital outlay is used to acquire, construct, repair, and maintain school district property, including software, housing, boarding students, and vocational schools operated under the Board of Education, school buses, asbestos control, other fixed assets. To get to this, the school districts can levy up to 8 mills. The median district gets 25% of state aid, and then we rank everybody highest to lowest, and the average valuation per pupil to the nearest thousandth to go ahead, to the nearest $1,000 to go ahead and get the amount that would go out in state aid for this. Capital improvement deals with bonds to finance school facilities. Fiscal year 2025, we have it at $208 million, which is a slight increase of $500,000. And then we kept it flat for 26 and 27. For CAPERS, but for all CAPERS numbers, we do use do talk to CAPERS themselves about the expected ratios that need to go into this. Fiscal year 2025 is $509.1 million. Fiscal year 26 is $527.6 million. Fiscal year 27 is $528 million. There's roughly 76,500 employees within CAPERS USDs. That's as of December of 23. For the CAPERS non-USDs, that includes interlocals, the co-ops, community colleges, technical colleges, and then the educational associations, which I learned this year includes the Kansas High School Athletics Association. So 2025 is $72.3 million, 26 is $75.3 million, 27 is $74.6 million, and there's roughly 11,000 non-USD employees. And the percentage is broken out as about roughly 48% for the interlocal co-ops, 45% for community colleges, and 6% in VOTEC. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for any questions on the fall consensus.
I know I had a follow-up question from Representative Brantley and then Representative Poskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question back on the other document on page 12. It said in figure 11, expenditures by program 24 through 26. It has on operating expenditures the COVID-19 programs. And is there still money for COVID, 14 million? Can you give me any more details on that?
Sure. The simple answer is yes, there is still money. There will be money going out the door through fiscal year 2026. The ESSER funds and then multiple other funds there are specific, so we have ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, and ESSER homeless. ESSER 3 and ESSER homeless still has money that is going out here in 26. There are other funds that have money going out. Which Thought I put my book up here, but I did not, but I'm sure that the agency would love to testify on that. And if they don't have it here today, I'm sure we will have information for you this week. But yes, there are still there's still COVID money going out, including the ESSER funds, and then a little bit in the other COVID-19 funds.
Is that the other COVID-19 programs at the bottom there, that would be the same thing?
Page 10.
Yes, same table.
Page 12, are we still there? Yeah, down,
12?
yep.
So in the COVID-19, at the top section, we're talking about operating costs at the agency level. So that is money that is going through the agency, and then the bottom money is the money going out to in-state aid. So they are broken up for operating expenditures as well as then the COVID-19 state aid dollars.
Thank you.
Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A little bit as a follow-up to Representative McNorton's question about special education. What I remember from our work in the committee last year is that the special education has not been funded at the statutory requirement of 92% since 2011. And what I want to follow up on is making sure that with our appropriation that we approved last year, that do I see that we're up to 74.5% for fiscal year 26? Is it correct that if we do not appropriate additional money, that in fiscal year 27, we will drop below 70% again to 68.4%? Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, so the fall 2024 estimate for 26 is 72%. But yes, you are correct in that in fiscal year 27, with no additional dollars, the way that it is currently is 68.4%.
Okay. And the statutory requirement's 92%.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair, this is Representative Steele. I have one.
Awesome. Fire away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jenny, thank you for your absolutely amazing information. This was fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit more about the ESSER funds and the categories, or am I just missing something in the document?
Mr. Chair, I do not have anything in the document itself that talks specifically about the COVID-19 funds or the ESSER funds. I know that I have more information on that. Mr. Chair, I have a piece of paper here that came from the budget narrative from the agency, so I'd be happy to speak to that, or if you would like the agency to speak more to this, I'd be happy to defer. It's your choice.
Let's let the agency answer that one, Representative. They'll be up in just a second, and I think they'd be able to speak in a little bit more depth of where that comes from and what they're using it for. I think that might be a little bit more the heart of your question, is not necessarily where it came from, but what's it being used for.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, do you have any other follow-ups before we move on?
No, Mr. Chair, that's good. Thank you.
This is awesome. I feel like I'm talking to the ceiling. All right, everyone, thank you. Last chance, last questions for Jennifer. It was great. Thank you for going over this for us, and your consensus estimates are great to be taken through so we can understand them better. I said better, not fully understand. Dr. Harwood, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to be here. Frank Harwood, Deputy Commissioner for the Kansas State Department of Education. I'd like to start off by thanking the Chair for allowing us some input in how we kind of attack this over the next 3 days. So the way we've kind of planned this is that today we're going to talk about consistent estimating and special education. Tomorrow we'll go into the enhancements that are flow through to school districts. And then on Wednesday, we talk about the operational enhancements. If we have questions that are coming up, I'll try to answer the ones that are there, but if they're tied specifically to one of those other topics, I may ask if you would like for us to try not to be confusing and move forward with that. Just to kind of start off with the consensus part, the good news is that the state board's recommendations and the special legislative special committee's House Bill 2007 are 98.3% in agreement. Okay, because it's $6 billion, so it's a lot of money. The other part I just want to point out is we had the question about the $21 million in reappropriation in foundation aid. Keep in mind that that's less than 0.5% of all of the funds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how consensus estimating works, but even though $21 million is a lot of money, it's a small part of all of that, and that's really pretty close. And understand that if we don't estimate just a tiny bit high, then we have to come back to this committee and try to get a current year reappropriation so that we can pay the bills for that year. So in that regard, I would say consensus did a pretty good job of saying to get within 0.5%, so that, but it's 0.5% on what I would consider the right side, so that you can reappropriate the $21 million versus us coming back and saying, hey, by the way, we need $50 million to pay the bills that you already agreed to pay. So I just like to, just for scale, keep that in mind. So we passed out a memo that said Kansas Education consensus components. We also sent in our testimony. The reason I put together the second document that we'll go through now is that I kind of wanted to break it out and look at each section. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail with special education than we did in our testimony. So to start off with state foundation aid, the way that those numbers come up in the consensus is a fiscal analyst for KLRD comes in with the inflation numbers and says, this is what base state aid should be based on the statute. The important thing to remember there, because we've gotten a couple of questions about 4.7% or 4.3% is a lot higher than inflation has been lately. Remember that it's a 3-year average, so a 3-year average look back. So we still have some months on the average from when inflation was higher. If you look at 2027's estimate, it's 2.7% because those larger numbers fall off before we get there. We also revised it down, and most likely in the spring we could revise it down just a little bit more because as some of those other numbers fall off and the trend that we're adding on has been lower. Now, if inflation ticks back up, we wouldn't lower it as much. If it goes down farther, we would do that. But just so you know where the base number comes from, that is a formula that KLRD fiscal analyst comes up with based on the statute. The other part of that is what you multiply that by. And so KSDE comes in with, this is what we think FTE will be, and weighted FTE. And so you notice we've revised some of those estimates down. For weightings, we didn't revise them down as much because you added money or costs to virtual state aid. Because, and I think Nick talked about this when he talked about the changes from last year. It used to be that if you were a part-time virtual student, you multiplied the FTE by 2,600 instead of 5,600. Now it's just you multiplying by the higher number. So virtual aid is going to go up. We also see a slight increase in virtual enrollment, so that's why we think virtual costs go up. Everything else comes down in weightings. You'll notice that we don't take as much off for 2027 or even for 2026 because we also are waiting to see what the legislature does this year that could impact weightings for next year. So an example of what happened last year is that you changed the year that we count. And so we used to count last year or the year before that for FTE. Now we count this year, last year, or for this year only, it's a average of last year and the year before. That's going to drop off. We're waiting to see what the impact that has. So again, the base number is just plug the numbers into the formula and that's what comes out. That changes from time to time because the inflation numbers change. The FTE numbers are our best guess. And quite frankly, we would like to be a little bit high. And 21 million sounds like it's a lot high, but again, it's only 0.5%. So that's how those come into play. The next one is supplemental state aid, which is also talked about as LOB. The amount of that is tied specifically or directly to the increase in the foundation aid, because districts calculate their general fund budget using the base aid and their weighted FTE. So if the base aid goes up, the general fund goes up, and then that means supplemental general fund goes up, assuming that they keep the same percentages. Districts can choose an LOB percentage between 15% and 33%. They could only go to 32% without a specific a resolution by the board. And so just for your information, this year, the lowest is 23.27%, and there are 126 districts at 33%, which is why when Jenny talked earlier that the average is now above 32%, there aren't very many that are very far below it. Some districts have just gone up with the average because they can take the average without a special resolution. If they do a resolution, that's subject to protest petitions, so their electorate could come in and say, no, we don't want to do that. The other option is that many years ago, you could go to a public vote and get to 33%. So we have districts that did that 4 or 5 years ago. That was when they had to do that. So, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to take questions on each of these as we go through, or I can get through the rest of the consensus estimate, or however you want to proceed.
Maybe do a couple more and then maybe get through the first full sheet and then we do questions on the front and then flip it over and you keep walking us through.
So the other thing I forgot to say about supplemental state aid and capital, which is also true for capital outlay state aid and capital improvement state aid, is the equity that it's supposed to be enhancing. So Nick also talked about, when he talked about the Gannon story, that you're looking at, you have a requirement for an equitable and an adequate funding formula. So the foundation aid is about adequate and educational equity. The rest of them are actually about tax equity. So for the supplemental state aid, a district does not get any more, their LOB is not any higher because they get state aid. Their mill levy is lower. So supplemental state aid is property tax relief. Districts don't get more or less, it's just what is the mill levy they have to levy to get what they are entitled to through the program. Capital outlay state aid is similar. The difference is that there are 2 levies that that a district levies that you just get whatever the levy says you get. So that's the 20 mil state aid, which goes, the districts don't keep anyway, and then capital outlay. Districts can levy up to 8 mills, and they just get whatever the 8 mills brings in. So they're not looking for a specific dollar amount, they're looking for whatever that is. The capital outlay aid, what you look at is based on the average valuation per pupil. Then the state kicks in extra dollars because that 8 mills just doesn't gain as much money in that district as it would in others. And all of the average valuation per pupil systems work basically the same way. We line up all the districts based on their average valuation per pupil. Each of them is a little different on where you kind of put the starting point. And then you get more or less the farther away you are from whatever that starting point is. So again, capital outlay state aid does give districts more capital outlay, but that's because their tax levy doesn't gain them as much proportionally as other districts. Capital improvement state aid is for bond and interest. So when a district passes a bond, if they get capital improvement state aid, they have a lower mill levy to pay their bond payments. This has changed significantly since 2015. All right, to the point where our estimates for 2025 are that we'll probably, we'll have to wait and see what we actually pay out, but it's about $188 million. And of that, we estimate that $178 million will go to 96, in support of 98 bonds that were passed before 2015, and 10 million will go to 26 bonds that have been passed since 2015. So as the pre-2015 bonds pay off, the capital improvement state aid will drop significantly. And if you live in a district that is considered a bond recently, the mill levies required to pay the bonds reflect that. And that there are only 84 districts that currently qualify for capital improvement state aid. And the average is 5%. So the last two are CAPERS. And so the interesting thing about that, so CAPERS employer, the first part is all for USD employees. And what happens with that is that we find out what are CAPERS eligible positions and what those payrolls are. And then we send out the employer portion of that to school districts. They have a very limited amount of time to then turn around and send that back to CAPERS. So we send them the money, and they turn around literally within the day, because there's this statute that they can't earn interest on it, and it goes back to CAPERS. So it goes quickly. The other one is for CAPERS non-USDs. So this would be community colleges and interlocals, and it's also technical colleges. The only difference with that is that some of those funds are not state general funds. Some of those are ELARF or lottery funds. So there's a little bit of a different, where the funds come from. But otherwise, it works the same. And that is just a quick overview of consensus estimating. You notice I left special ed out because I'm going to spend a lot more time on special ed.
Yeah, let's take questions on the first section first. If anybody has any questions. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Frank, that supplemental state aid up there, the lower the second paragraph, the lower a school district's property values per student, the more supplemental state aid is eligible to receive for its LOB. Explain that to me. Is that a percentage basis?
Yes. So the average supplemental state aid is 32% of the LOB, and that's based on their average valuation per pupil. So I don't remember what the average valuation per pupil, what the average is, but the higher you go, then you get a higher percentage of your LOB paid for by the state, and the lower you go, is the less you get. So some districts get no supplemental state aid because their average valuation per pupil, based on the statute, says you can pay it on your own. Other districts, and basically what that would mean is that for other districts to actually levy a 33% LOB, the mill levy required to do that would be inequitable to provide the educational experience that another district can without state aid. So that's why I talk about it's actually tax equity and not education equity, because what it's doing is letting districts receive the same percentage of their general fund with a similar tax levy based on the average valuation per pupil.
Do you know what those mill levies range for across the state?
I don't know. We could find that out, but it's a wide range. But some of it is based on what your average value, what your appraised value is. The other part is what did you choose to do? We could look at it for the districts that have levied 33%. That would be the easiest one to look at it for, because otherwise you get a choice that the district made to keep that lower. Some districts will get to the revenue neutral rate hearing and say, well, we're going to lower our LOB from 32 to 31.5 so we can stay revenue neutral. Other districts, their communities have said raise as much as you can, and they stay at 33%.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Harwood. I appreciate the elementary breakdown of a complex situation. The capital improvement state aid, you said since 2015, lots of changes. You said 84 districts qualify now, and there's only 26 projects left?
So so since 2015, there have been 26 bond issues passed that qualify for capital improvement state aid. There have been more bond issues than that, but most of them don't qualify for capital improvement state aid. So we estimate that this year, we'll send $10 million to districts, those 26 districts, to help pay their bond and interest. We're going to send $180 million to 92 districts to help with their bond issues that were passed before 2015.
So 26 different districts with 26 bond issues. Okay, thank you.
And just a follow-up, so when would said a lot of those bonds are gonna fall off here pretty soon? Are they staggered? Do a lot of them fall off in the next 5 years?
So I will tell you that 2015 was a big year for bond issues because districts went out and said, hey, we want to get in on the old law. If you look at those, some of those would be 20 to 30-year bonds, depending on how they were trying to restructure that. So, I mean, so 2015 was 10 years ago. You could still have bonds that were passed in 1995 that would now be getting paid off. So it'll be a process. But each year that one of those pays off, the districts or the state's share of capital improvement state aid will decrease.
Thank you for that. Representative McNorton.
I have a quick question, Dr. Harwood, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So on the SGF reappropriation, you talk about it being 0.5%. I appreciate that. So in your next year's budget, you have some cushion already built into that budget, so you are planning on having that little bit of cushion or
No,
not?
so-
I guess so. If we put this forward, are we giving you double cushion?
No. So it reappropriates to the next year, but we still only get whatever the total approved amount is. Right. So it reduces the new appropriation, but because it gets reappropriated, it just gets taken out of this year and added to the following year. We don't get it twice. It's just that the state has to put in less money to get to the number they need to get to this year.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate that confirmation that it's not a twice, it's just built back into it.
It's not a pool that just keeps building up. Whatever the appropriation is for that year that's what we have. It's just how much money the state had to put in to get to that number. The more that gets reappropriated, the less more money has to be put in.
Correct.
And that's the difference between if it lapsed or not, and we'll kind of get to some of that in a minute.
Well, it looks like we've got some special education stuff you want to talk about, so we'll give you the rest of the committee to walk us through as far as you can.
All right. So this is an updated version of a memo that I presented to the Senate last year. And really what I wanted to make sure that we do is help you understand kind of all the parts that get in there. This will kind of get back to Representative McNorton's question about the 92% and how all those things work. Just really want to point out that our special education formula was developed in 1974. And so it's been tweaked over time, but that's kind of what we've had through that time. And so the table that you see at the bottom, I guess this would be page 2, the first part of the special ed part, just walks through how we calculate what the appropriation should be if it was 92% of excess costs. And so you start with how much did districts spend in the previous year for special education? And that comes out of their Fund 30. And if it doesn't get paid out of Fund 30, it doesn't count. And it can only be in Fund 30 if it was in service of a student's IEP. So you can't pay for just a second grade teacher out of special ed. They have to be in service of a student's IEP. So we start with that, and then we make a guess on what will be for next year. Because remember, we're doing this for current year. And so typically what it is, most of the money is people. So we look at what were the increases in salaries, what would be increases in transportation, and so we add to that, and it was about 5% this year, because that was about what salaries and things went up. So we added 5%, and we come up with $1.2 billion. The next thing that we do is subtract out the state aid that districts get for the special education students that they are educating. So we figure out that that's $6,271 per student, and that would be the base aid plus some of the weightings. The weightings that don't count are at-risk, bilingual, CTE, transportation. Am I missing one? Okay. And the reason for that, the reason for those being taken out is those are already there specifically to pay for something else. So low enrollment weighting stays in because that's just there to pay for that student. And then we multiply that times the FTE of students, special education students. This is not head count. There are about 92,000 special education students, but we have an FTE based on how much of their time is spent in special ed versus general ed. And so you multiply those together, that was $186 million. There was a change to the formula last year, where now what we do is we multiply that by the average LOB, because that's also money that districts get. That'd be $60 million. And we also subtract out federal aid, and we subtract out, this is the $2.5 million of federal aid that's actually being paid for special ed this year. So, and then we take out Medicaid reimbursement, and then we take out $300,000 for services that the state hospitals provide to special education students. And so you get a total excess cost, you start with 1.2 million, you end up with 796 million. You multiply that by 92%, it's 733 million. And the appropriation this year was 601 million. So it's a difference of about $122 million short of the 92%. Okay? Questions on that part?
Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The state hospital admin cost, is that just a fixed number, or does that get adjusted?
I've asked that question in the last year I've been here, and that's been a fixed number that hasn't changed for years.
Okay, thank you.
No inflation on that or nothing, huh?
It's been a little hard to figure out exactly what it's supposed to represent. I'm still working on that, but that's the number that has been agreed to for years.
Okay. Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So do we have any limits or caps or anything that a school district can spend on a SPED program per student? I mean, can they come up with something they're paying their SPED teachers $500,000 a year and they got whatever, or are we just taking their word that they're, I mean, being frugal enough that they're spending the money properly?
So I'll talk a little bit about what we audit.
Okay.
But the school district would be required to provide whatever is in the IEP. Now, the question you have about if they're paying special education teachers $500,000, that would be a district decision. We would audit to make sure that we knew that, but what you'll find out is they're only going to get reimbursed $31,000, doesn't matter how much they pay them. Yeah.
So we do have some checks or balances.
Actually, I'll talk about those in just a minute.
Thank you.
Representative McDonald. Almost did it to you again. You guys always go in pairs.
Sorry.
Representative McDonald.
I'm really proud of myself for keeping up with my note taking, but I did slip in the second spot on this chart. Can you tell me again what SPED FTE students means?
So you take anybody who's got an IEP, that IEP determines how much service time they get. The vast majority of our IEPs are for speech language, and they actually spend very little. I mean, a typical speech language student has very little time. So that's why there's such a big difference between 92,000 IEPs and only 30,000 FTE. There are other students that would be a 1.0 FTE, but that's where the difference comes from.
Thank you.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The $601 million down here at the bottom of the page, is that the 75 we put in last year or whatever it was, 72, 75?
So that includes the 73 million that you put in SGF. The 2.5 million is actually above that in federal funds.
Okay.
So we took that out of the expenses early because it was federal funds, but the net is the same, so yes.
Okay, so, yeah. So we would have been basically 200 million if we hadn't been below, if we hadn't got that 72.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll let you continue to press on, see if
All
we
right.
got some more questions for you.
Now what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I won't spend as much time on this, this is the distribution formula. And so it's called categorical aid because there are 4 categories. The first one is catastrophic aid. So this is for those students that require a great deal of service. But you'll see that it's limited to 2 times what we reimburse for a teacher, which was $31,000, so $60,000. And you kind of pull it back through there. So it's catastrophic aid, but it doesn't really, and you only can get 75% of that. So you subtract out the 60,000, and then you can get 75% of what's left. And you can see that in 24-25, we distributed $1.3 million for 45 students. And some of these students, I mean, in a lot of cases, these students are not attending their home school. They could be in specialized settings. All right. Medicaid replacement is very different than Medicaid reimbursement. Okay, Medicaid reimbursement, what I talked about before that we subtract out, are Medicaid payments that go through KDHE to school districts for Medicaid eligible services that they provide. Medicaid replacement is $9 million of whatever's appropriated divided by how many Medicaid eligible students districts serve. This was added to the formula in about 2009 because Medicaid, the state changed the way they did Medicaid reimbursement, and they were trying to ease the change for districts that got a lot of Medicaid reimbursement at the time. So in this case, it's $9 million. And so for 23-24, it was $8,986,880 for 15,232 students. The reason that it's not $9 million is we divide and then round down and then multiply. We have to round down because it can't be more than $9 million. So we round down and the rest of it just goes back, stays in the categorical aid formula. Okay? So the next one is transportation aid, and districts can get reimbursement for transportation for transporting students with an IEP if transportation is called for in the IEP. So not anybody that has an IEP should get transportation. This should be somebody that because of their disability, they need specialized transportation. The other thing that they can get reimbursed for is teacher travel, special teacher travel between buildings, because a lot of times one special education teacher may serve a number of schools and even districts, depending on co-ops and or locals. So they can get reimbursed for that travel, those expenses.
I'll call on Representative McDonald right now while it's fresh.
With like a special teacher, I know we're talking about special ed right now, but is there something in the formula to help like pay for ESL teachers who might travel or other professionals, just special ed?
You cannot use this for reimbursement of any other travel other than travel in service of an IEP.
But is there something else in the school finance formula to cover those other traveling?
They could consider that a bilingual expense and use their bilingual funding for that.
But not like speech pathologists? Well,
So
that
speech
is.
pathologist,
that
special
is-
ed.
Yeah, okay, I'm with you, thank you.
Okay, so then the last category is special teacher reimbursement. And so what we do is we take, in this case, $528 million. We subtract out the catastrophic aid, we subtract out the Medicaid replacement, and we subtract out the, I forgot to say, $85 million in transportation, and we get what's left. And we divide that by the FTE of the staff that are serving the students. And so, and we distribute it. So in 23-24, that was $433 million for 8,870 teachers. and 11,980 paraeducators. The paraeducators are reimbursed at 0.4 of a teacher, so their FTE would have been 4,801. So the total FTE was, let's see, I could do the math, 12,000, 13,000 something, okay? Which would have been almost 9,000 teachers and almost 12,000 paras. There's also a part for summer education, which was $7.6 million for 189 teachers and 133 paras. The 133 paras was 53.04% or FTE. And what we came up with is that we reimbursed districts $31,670 per FTE. So back to Representative McNorton's question, if you pay your special education teachers $40,000 or $100,000, you still get $31,670 per teacher. Okay? Which we'll come back to later, by the way. So one thing I do want to talk about with the reappropriation that is in House Bill 2007, we would recommend that you do not lapse the special education funding. It's not about the $23,000. It's about the process in that if you reappropriate it, you are actually reducing the funding towards maintenance of fiscal support. It won't make any difference this year. Typically, we have to reappropriate between $100,000 and $150,000 a year. That's based on, same thing, we divide the money divided by the staff, then we round down. So we always just have money we can't send out. If you reappropriate it, we can use that next year and we can try to send it out next year. If you don't, if you lapse it like what's in 2007, we can't. And that also reduces your maintenance of fiscal support. We only made maintenance of fiscal support for 24 by about $150,000. So the $23,000 wouldn't make any difference. This year, you're going to be fine because you put in $73 million. I think it's a bad idea to get in this habit because if you get to a year where you don't add to special education and you reappropriate what we couldn't distribute that year, you could find yourself violating maintenance of fiscal support. If you leave it in there so that we can give it next year, then you wouldn't necessarily do that. And again, it's typically less than $150,000 out of $600 million. So all the rest of the reappropriations we don't have any concern with because those were funds that didn't get used in that year and we can't do anything else with, so we move them forward. So the other one was lapsed was the juvenile detention. We've been spending less on juvenile detention because of changes made to juvenile code in the past. So we don't see a problem with that one, but our recommendation is not to lapse the special education reappropriation.
Representative Hoskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify when it says maintenance of fiscal support, is that what we refer to as maintenance of effort?
So,
is it the same thing or different?
So maintenance of effort is, MOE is for school districts. Maintenance of fiscal support is for state agencies.
Thank you.
So it's the same thing at the state level. Yep. All right. So a little bit then on the next part to to Representative McNorton's question. So our auditors audit transportation expenses, catastrophic aid expenses, and FTE that gets submitted. So we audit those to make sure that they got what they were supposed to. The way that works is that that gets audited the next year, and then you get a negative correction. I will tell you as a former superintendent, you wanted, in a relatively large district, you wanted about a $20,000 to $50,000 negative correction every year because we don't do positive corrections. So being a little bit over by about the same amount every year meant that you were maximizing your funding. If you were ever under, you didn't get it. I mean, we didn't have a way to pay it anymore. So that's just the way it works through. So we do audit what they turn in for those expenses. We don't audit specifically all of Fund 30, but we do look at the other expenses. So the next part is payments. Gets very confusing. So for 24, 25.
Mr. Chair, this is
Sorry.
Representative Steele. I have a question. Can I ask?
Sure.
Thank you. I just wanted a clarification, on the transportation. Does this include costs if, let's say that a student has an IEP for speech therapy, but the speech therapist is not in their school building, so that they have to be bused to another one? Does that include it? But they actually really don't need the bus service for their disability.
So in that situation, in order to provide this service, the school is going to either have to transport the student or the teacher, and they could claim reimbursement for either of those.
Okay, thank you.
The key is it has to be in service of an IEP.
Representative McDonald.
Good job. Just real quick, you've said Fund 30 twice now, and I don't know what that is. Can you enlighten me?
If you go look at any district's budget, Code 30 or Fund 30 is special education. Don't get it confused with Fund 78, which is for co-ops. So some districts have money there if they're the sponsor of the co-op. Their own are in Fund 30. Sorry about that. Sometimes I speak like everybody else has been doing this for 30 years too.
I kind of figured, but I didn't know. It's a good question, good clarifying
Good
question.
So the next part is that districts do not receive any special education funding until October 15th of the year that's happening. They get their last payment in June. Okay? They actually don't know what their special education payments for the year will be until about June 10th, which is the 12th month of the fiscal year. So what that means is that when we pay them their last payment in June, they've already paid all their bills. And so they will have a high cash balance moving into the next year because they need that money to make payments until we give them more money in October. So when you start looking at cash balances, and that's one of the things I was going to talk about last week and we'll get to later, is that some funds need high cash balances because of cash flow. And it's because we don't know, they turn in May what their final FTE for staff is. We calculate what the final payments are going to be, and we settle up in June after all those teachers are gone. So that's why you need a higher cash balance because of the way that happens. The next part is federal special education aid. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. It just talks about some of the, how much money is there. The next section is district level special education excess costs. This was kind of hotly debated for the last couple of years. I will say that I don't think that the district level excess cost calculation is a valid measure of special education costs. The excess cost calculation is statewide. It just doesn't work out well at the district level because of how much you're paying your teachers, what is the percentage of catastrophic aid or transportation. There are just all these different factors where it doesn't work well. However, we were required to calculate that based on a formula that's in the law before we could make the first payment in October. So we actually did that in May and sent it out. We'll do that again. We'll actually send it out for the 31st, but that's actually our one for next year. So next week, we'll be sending that out again. We held off a little bit because we just sent out the local contribution state aid I'm going to talk about a little bit on the 15th, and we had enough confusion with that. We didn't need to add more.
I don't want to confuse this issue because it's kind of confusing enough on the payment schedule, but the special way, and I think you were part of this idea of the State Board of Education doing an equalization. Am I jumping you ahead?
That is the next page.
I definitely wanted to get to that because how did that work? What could you tell us about that process? Did it do what it was in a sense intended to do?
I think it did as well as we could come up with a solution for. So, and I'll kind of go through that. So as part of House Sub for Senate Bill 387, the State Board of Education was directed to come up with a new distribution formula for special education funds for any funds in excess of the FY24 appropriation. So if you look about in the middle of the page, that was $73,302 because it was 601,018,818 minus 528,018,516. So we came up with a solution. What I heard from especially from the conference committee was we wanted to be able to equalize the payment based on what districts had to pay from local funds. So the chart that's there is an example. This would be an average. Actually, I just looked at this averages from the information that's out there. So an average district spends $3.6 million on special ed. So then we subtracted out the money they got to pay for that. So the average district gets $1.8 million in state aid and $211 million in federal aid, which would include Medicaid reimbursement. So that meant that the district had to pay $1.4 million from either general fund or LOB or supplemental general fund from local sources. So it could have been bake sales. We talked about that. We don't know where the money comes from. We just know they had to pay it. Statewide, the local effort was $439 million. So this average district gets 0.349% of the new money. So we just take 0.349650, and we had to figure out how many zeros, how many significant figures we could have in order to get as close to $73,302 as we could. And so this average district is $255,246. I talked about this with districts a lot over the summer and through the fall. I didn't get any complaints about the methodology. There were a lot of questions about how this worked with co-ops and interlocals, which is a completely different situation because I can't tell them what to do, that they have their own governing bodies. So we tried to work with that. But I didn't get any pushback from, this is just a bad way to figure this out. Now, what I will say is this method will work for a while. I think it would be a bad idea for this to continue in the long term, and then you're locked up with $528 million with the one thing, and then as the other one gets to be a bigger part, I'm not sure how well it will last. I think it's doing fine right now. If you're talking about through 2027, because that will be part of the Education Funding Task Force, I think it'll be fine. If not, I'll go back to the state board and say, I think we need to change it around because the state board can change the formula. Okay.
Questions? Go ahead. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Harwood. This calculation that you came up with here, I'm still trying to understand that a little bit, looking at it. Are we reimbursing districts at the same percentage? I mean, that's not the right way to determine it, or to say it, but you're figuring out what their percentage of state special ed is, and then they're getting extra money as a ratio of that.
So they get a proportion of the new funding based on the proportion of local funds they spent compared to what all districts across the state spent locally. So they get a share of the new money based on the share of the local funding they provided.
Okay, so, and are we, as I recall, the intent of this law was to make sure those districts that had a lower percentage of their excess cost would get more money, and those that had a higher percentage would get less money. Is that what's happening?
So we didn't use the excess cost calculation because we thought that would be disequalizing, but the way we come up with local contribution is how much did you spend, how much did you receive from all sources, what's left over. So yes, a district that spends proportionally more of local dollars for special ed gets a higher proportion of the new money.
Okay, I I think that's close enough to the intent of what we wanted, so, yeah, thank you.
Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for having this presentation today. Dr. Harwood, well, committee, I know there was some talk earlier of, our base state aid being per pupil and our special education formula being, per instructor or, educator. And I hope after today's presentation, it makes a little bit more sense why we do it that way. But then also on the distribution methodology put in last year's bill, you said something at the end of the Senate presentation last year that no district received more than 100% of special education reimbursement. And I know we have a lot of new members here, but I also know we have some returning members that did see those graphs that I think helped add to the confusion to bring us to the temporary solution, which I thank you for.
So I said that because there were members of the legislature that would talk about districts that got 200% of their excess costs. And that's what I think is part of the problem is with the excess cost calculation. No district received more aid than they had in expenses. So nobody was making money on special ed. Now, there were some districts that got a lot closer to it than others, which is why this formula then recognizes that some districts don't get very much because a higher percentage of their expenses were covered with state or federal aid.
Do you think with the two systems that kind of the current proportion of it does work because it allows for some base funding almost and then some supplemental kind of words we use in this, but
so
it's kind of how I view it. But I just wondered if the ratio works kind of right now, like you were talking, that in the future, if we only have half in the base and the other half in the supplemental, might not work quite as well as right now.
Right.
15% in the supplemental and.
I think as the supplemental gets, or as the additional funding, if that got higher and got closer to that amount, I think that we would have to really look at, is it working well? I think it worked fine this year. If we talk about 2 more years, I think it will be fine. But I think the Education Funding Task Force should take a serious look at, if we want to continue doing this, is this the right way? The other thing would be, does the legislature want to continue to have the state board develop funding formulas? So.
I'm going to do last question, then I have a couple announcements, and we'll let everybody part.
I have my enhancement request on the last page to go through.
Oh, okay. We'll let you.
Those are
Representative McDonald.
As a person who sits on the Education Funding Task Force, my ears perked up a lot when you said we're fine until 27. And so I pulled out my chart to try to figure out if we amp this up over 3 years or 4 years or 2 years, what do we need to do to get there by 27 when we make these decisions? And if my math is right, the agency wants to do a 3-year phase-in. The governor wants a 4-year phase-in, but it would take a 2-year phase-in to get to 92% before the end of 2027. Does that make sense? So I'm wondering if we need to put on a more aggressive cap as far as trying to get to fully the 92%. If you feel like our current method is going to be shaky after 27.
The reason I talk about fine through 27 is my understanding the Education Funding Task Force is going to be looking at special education funding. So I'm assuming that when they get done, that will be revamped. So I think we're fine through the current timeline that we have. So I'm not worried about using the same formula for the next couple of years. But if it's being looked at holistically by that task force, if the task force decides not to do anything with it, then I'd be surprised. But actually, to answer the rest of your question, which is my enhancement request, so the state board is requesting $82,692,000. That's a reduction from what Ginny talked about because our budget is due to the governor. We have to approve it in July. This is a revision based on the November estimate, so it is $5 million lower than the original one, and that's in our testimony. And that actually is a continuation of the state board's 5-year plan that there are just 3 years left of. The governor had a 4-year plan. Now there are 3 years left, and she requested $72,632,000. The state board's plan would have us at 92% by FY '28, and the governor's would be by FY '29. Without any increases, we'd be down to 72% in FY '26, which would be about $167 million short of the statutory requirement.
Which is a big one that we'll need to deliberate on the next couple days and vote on Thursday. Okay. Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, with the whole new budgeting process and the session schedule being so different, what I don't have a good grasp on is we're looking at fall consensus. How does it affect that we will be out of session before spring consensus? And do we have time for that question?
I have time.
Okay, thanks.
Actually, we've been discussing that because typically we wouldn't have the new revenue estimates until April after they're gone. Your bill doesn't actually have a base amount in it. So if you approve what's in here at 5611, if that goes down, then we'll just be over appropriated and you would reappropriate that later. If it goes up, you would have to come back next year and ask for a new appropriation to cover the additional costs. Based on what inflation has done, I would expect it to go down, but the legislature could be out of session before either the revenue or the education consensus committees meet.
Thank you very much for your presentation that you were ready to do last week. But we did a good job voting out, and we took a while. So thank you for your patience. Thanks for being here today. Both you and Ms. Light did a great job. I wanted to approve the minutes. Everybody had a copy of that? Representative Estes.
I move we approve the minutes as published.
Do I have a second? Representative McNorton, seconds. All in favor, say aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you for that. And I wanted to do a clarifying announcement on, we're going to do public comment on K-12 budget Wednesday at 4:30 to 5, like the last 30 minutes of the day. So people who want to sign up, and I kind of just advertise this to those that are normally here, but if they're, and I'm thinking if we have, however many we have sign up, they'll get 1 or 2 minutes, or they'll get 3 minutes, or they'll get 5 or 6 minutes. We'll just split them out evenly. And the main thing I wanted to say, this is open public comment before we vote on K-12 budget. These are 4 or 5 minutes or whatever. I'm saying yes to the in-person and WebEx testimony, first come, first serve. The time frame will be split out equally. Testimony submitted by Tuesday at noon will be accepted and scheduled. So if they get it in tomorrow by noon and want to do WebEx or in person, we'll split them out equally. If it's after that, we'll still get it up on the site as testimony that the committee can consider, but it'll be written only. Okay, just because there's only so much we can do in a short amount of time. So written only afternoon. You can do it in person before noon. And that's all I got. We are adjourned.